Okay.
So Neil, can you just who are you and what is the nature of your participation in the American Pavilion this year?
Sure. Okay, my name is Niall Atkinson. I'm an associate professor of art history at the University of Chicago. I'm an architectural historian, and my specialty is actually late medieval and Renaissance Italian architecture and urbanism. But one of the core interests of my research is the relationship between society and space, between bodies and buildings, and the ways in which space, urban space, for example, architecture, defines community, and the way that communities inscribe their identity into urban space. And that's really what I'm trying to look at a great deal of my work historically. And so the nature of my participation here comes from, sort of on a practical side, from the fact that we are initiating more discussions about architecture at Chicago, because we do not have an architecture school.
Right.
And so, but we now have a robust dialogue going on of a mix of scholars who are working on urban issues and whatnot. So, having said that, the initial discussions that we were having about this, but the theme of this show was built upon the ways in which we could actually sort of play out that discourse. And so along with my colleagues, Mimi Zeiger and Louis, but also Ollie Palmer at the beginning, there was a 5-person team, and Amy Thomas. Amy Thomas was a postdoc researcher at Chicago at the time, architectural historian of the 20th century. Ollie Palmer was an architectural theorist, filmmaker. The 5 of us began thinking about what would be the kinds of relationships or issues that architecture could facilitate in understanding what citizenship can be. In a way, partly because the architecture of citizenship is, on a very literal level, the architecture of borders, detention centers, processing zones, and that kind of thing. And so, in order to maybe expand or get beyond the idea of citizenship as a kind of just a narrow legal definition of status, to think about it more as a function of gestures,
right,
of gestures that people make. In other words, can architecture facilitate certain kinds of communication and interaction and sociability from the level of the body, the individual citizen, right, to outer space. And so that's where the scales sort of start coming in.
So the exhibition goes from a very micro level where we start, there's a stone, to all the way to the cosmos.
Absolutely, yeah. So the narrative is, from that right there, right, so, to Andres Hernandez and Amanda Williams' piece here with Shannon Crow, and then continues from citizen, civitas, region, nation, globe, network, and cosmos. So that's how it runs.
The approach also has a certain base in the materiality and ecology, but taking a more generalist view of how ecosystems participate in forming identity. Can you describe, for example, the idea of nexus?
Sure, yeah.
How does that fit into the notion of citizen?
Sure. Of course, the issue of the U.S.-Mexico border is an issue, a very contemporary issue that we're dealing with right now. And I think that the work of Studio Cruz, Teddy Cruz, and Fona Furman, that this collaboration is this long-term dialogue that literally and metaphorically across the border, right? So there is a constant sort of, in what they're doing, a constant series of flows back and forth, right, across the border. And I think instead of imagining a national border as simply a line, right, that divides, the inside from the outside, or from these people from that people, to imagine the border as a thick zone that actually is populated by things, animal life, plant life, crops, cities. Has its has a certain kind of ecology. So the borders of that map, right, or the shape of that map are defined by the 8 watersheds that exist, and these watersheds depend on being able to flow back and forth, right, between what is now the United States and Mexico. And so when they dive deep through their documentation into the Tijuana estuary, we have pieces of the border wall that are actually disrupting and wounding, right, these flows between animals, plants, causing certain kinds of pollution and disrupting the flow of water and that kind of thing. And so, to imagine the border as a positive rather than a kind of just something that divides, I think is important for that project.
Exhibition also goes seen in the light of current politics in America, certain nativism. It seems in some ways a response to both the nativism that we're seeing in places like the United States but worldwide. Was that something that was part of your thinking, responding to this as architects to this sort of political discourse going on?
Right. I mean, certainly.
This
discourse is going on. But I think its current iteration. We've always been talking about the relationship between us and them, and I think that it's taken on new forms. But what we're trying to do is really to expand that dialogue or that conversation, right, to include much more sort of nuanced and sophisticated ways of talking about what borders are and who belongs, who's inside and who's outside. And I think the actual practice of Teddy Cruz and Fonoforman of engaging with nonprofits on both sides of the divide between Tijuana and San Diego, and highlighting the fact that this is really one single urban agglomeration, just like it's one single natural region, and that at the urban level you can not sidestep, but you can in a way overcome that that national border, acting as local citizens of two different cities who can facilitate ways of making creating that urban condition in which two peoples are actually communicating and helping working to ameliorate environmental degradation, that kind of thing.
You also bring in Keller Easterling's work on here and the notion of network and cosmos. This is very much macro perspective where you're trying to bring it to a much more universal idea. What do you think the United States, in terms of these ideas, can contribute to a more universal dialogue? Because North America has always been a very sort of closed place to the rest of the world because of its geography. How do you feel now that as a geography, what can it contribute to a global idea of a global citizen, for example?
I think, let me think for a minute about that, because I don't want to really speak from my own particular position, but maybe use these works to think about that. Keller Easterling's piece might be a great example because in a way it sort of just rejects the notion of citizenship as we understand it completely. The premise, okay, so if we have 65 million people, right, in the world who are displaced, if that kind of those kind of migration routes and flows, if that becomes a constant condition of a certain number of the world's population, well then, how do you turn that into a positive spatial dimension? Maybe you could create ways in which they become moving global citizens, and I think that her application, which works to share assets and needs amongst that are temporary, right? To get people into places, to collaborate, and then to move on to the next place. And so to turn the issue of migration into something that is actually forms bonds and a form of citizenship that transcends the nation state. And I think in a way, if not to say that a national border should ever completely disappear, but that you can have multiple forms of citizenship. So you can have nations, which doesn't necessarily preclude the idea of having a supranational kind of identity. I think that's what she's exploring there, which I think is really a fascinating way to think about migration as a positive spatial phenomenon or experience, for example.
And the last question, the exhibition has you see a lot of sort of almost scientific analysis, almost kind of technical, very detailed analysis. What do you feel is the role of science in architecture now? Because I see a lot of forensic architecture, for example, has all these mappings. And it seems like this is becoming a much more central part of architecture now, this extremely detailed scientific approach to analyzing space. And the maps here, we can also see that.
Sure. I mean, in two cases, for example, maybe Scape, the landscape architectural firm, working with local scientists here who are working on regenerating the salt marshes in the Venetian lagoon, but also with other projects and other endangered wetland areas as well. That's exactly what's happening, as well as say Scofidio and Renfro's piece, where there's a collaboration between a geographic visualization team and then the process of analyzing data and visualizing that, thinking about architecture at a global level. In terms of the Scape project, I mean, I think really this kind of collaboration is in a way, in practice, something that often does not happen. I mean, from my position as an academic in a humanities discipline, the University of Chicago was trying very hard in several initiatives to get the hard scientists to collaborate with humanists, and it's these are worlds that speak very different languages, and so these kind of collaborations I think are key, especially when we talk about something like the regeneration of wetlands, like these very fragile ecosystems that need to be understood as these sort of living, dynamic ecologies. And what I think is important in this case is to connect the science and that data to actual sort of more metaphorical, symbolic forms, right, of life. So.
This is a very important thing you just said.
Good, I'm glad, because it's important to me, really, because
what is that metaphor, though?
Well, I'm going to tell you concretely what I'm thinking in this metaphor, and this is what we are talking about tomorrow afternoon when we are bringing guests to Certosa to talk about ecologies, to talk about rising sea levels and the effects on these kinds of liminal zones, right? These wetlands are neither sea nor earth, and so it's really important because the city of Venice couldn't exist without the particular makeup of this lagoon. And in the past, for 1,000 years now, well, 1,000 years ago, up until about the 18th century, Venice imagined this relationship to the sea, this special relationship, as a form of marriage. And every year, right from until the 18th century, the Doge of Venice would be handed a ring in the morning in St. Mark's, and they would say a mass. And then he would sail out in his ceremonial big gondola, along with the Patriarch of Venice, and as many Venetians as could possibly fill the lagoon coming after them. And they would ride to a place where the lagoon meets the Adriatic Sea. So right at the place where the real salt water of the sea meets the semis.
So the place had a particular metaphoric connection.
Exactly, because it's all over these thresholds, right? And so they would have a ceremony there where figuratively the Doge would marry the sea as a kind of symbolic way of saying Venice is in fact wedded to the sea, and the ring would be thrown into the lagoon. And although in the past this was used as a kind of justification for Venice's right to rule the seas and to and their sort of their marine conquest of large parts of the Mediterranean, it's also, I mean, a ritual way of thinking about your relationship to nature, the natural world, right? And I think that it helps to think about it in terms of hard data and analysis, but also that relationship can be strengthened by the kind of more, say, emotional and or symbolic relationship that you develop towards something that to an ecosystem that we're trying to think about as if we think of ecological citizenship, what it could mean. How can we commune with this? How can we understand that the natural world is not something that we just sort of started destroying in the last 100 years. We've been living with it for forever. We need it, it needs us, and so to recalibrate that relationship through ritual forms is, I think, as important as understanding it scientifically.
As a last question, for somebody that's not an architect or in intellectual circles, just coming here as a normal citizen, what would you say to them? Like, what could they find in this exhibition? Laymen, when they come here, from our discourse as architects and humanists, what can we contribute to a more popular understanding of some of these ideas?
Sure. I mean, one thing that I think is important for me, let me start at the back end. I mean, some of our off-site program that we're doing, we're engaging with local Venetian organizations who are working to reinvent or to reimagine a robust civic society through certain forms of activism and engagement. And I think it's really important for people who are not architects, say, who are not urban planners, who are not government legislators, for example, imagine that they have a role to play in the design of their city, right? In redesigning space to configure it according to their needs. So if you come in here, what I think you'll find, especially as soon as you enter and see Studio Gang's piece, in which they're trying to reimagine what is a more inclusive civic monument for the city that had just torn down its two Confederate statues. Their practice engages in a long dialogue with the people who are going to be maybe using the new public spaces that they're creating for the city. So that long dialogue is a creative way of both the architect and the so-called layman, the people who are going to live with this stuff, to imagine together how you could redesign in the best possible way new forms of public engagement, sort of sociability and that kind of thing. And so I think that's really important. So if I would say to someone, coming to this pavilion, I mean, to look at these works as suggestive, speculative. Like, there's no didacticism going on there. They're not telling you what the answers are. The answers could come from the spectator's engagement with the work, right? So that, I think there's a certain way in which you can be more interactive with the works here, that they stimulate a certain ways of thinking, that maybe reorient the way you think about the world around you. And if we can do that, then the person, the viewer will imagine having a real stake and responsibility, right, in urban design, in urban life, in which they are collaborators with architects and planners and things like that.
Great. That was Niall Atkinson at the
University of Chicago.
At one of the curators of the National Pavilion of the United States of America, May 25th, 2018 in Venice. Thank you, Niall. Thank you for creating very nice exhibition. For me, it was a step above what I've seen in the American pavilions before in terms of this.
Well, we really appreciate that. No, and on behalf of my colleagues, I really have to include my colleagues here, Mimi Zeiger and Anne Louis and Igor Gil, the three other curators involved. Just the kind of creative way that they're thinking, their writing ability, they have a really sort of fabulous visual sense. They're detail oriented, they're big picture. I mean, it's really them who are responsible for what you're seeing in there. And so it's been a real learning experience working with them. It's been absolutely incredible.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.